Okay, thanks for joining us, everybody. And now, live from Amarna. Well, actually, I'm in Denver, but that is Amarna behind me, you can see. We're going to do tonight the Amarna Royal Court, the city, and its officials. Okay, here's a summary of what I'll cover tonight. We'll begin with the king, his god, the Aten, his capital at Amarna. We'll go on a walking tour of Amarna and get to know the city better. I'll cover the king's royal family, his court officials, other workers at Amarna, and finish by listing the modern excavations at the city. Before we begin, a brief commercial. Since its founding, the Amarna Research Foundation, or TARF, supported the excavation, conservation, and publication of work at Amarna. TARF purchased a total station, and it supported mapping and resistivity and ground-penetrating radar studies. TARF funded security fences, gates, doors for buildings and tombs. TARF supported work on Amarna Period tombs at both Thebes and Saqqara, and has provided local employment for villagers for the excavation and conservation work. And we'd love to have your support. For more information and back issues of over 20 years of our publications, visit our website at www.theamarnaresearchfoundation.org. Let's begin with a review of Akhenaten and his father, Amenhotep III. 18th dynasty king Amenhotep III ruled for about 37 years, between 1388 and 1351 BCE. His birth name, Amenhotep, means Amun is satisfied. Necher, god, Heka, ruler of Waset, or Thebes. In other words, Amun is satisfied, god and ruler of Thebes. Around 1353 BCE, Amenhotep III's oldest son died, and his second oldest son, who was also named Amenhotep, became the crown prince, and then a little later he became co-regent. And only 2 years afterwards, Amenhotep III was dead. So the new king, Amenhotep IV, was about 27 years old at the time. His birth name was the same as his father's, Amenhotep. This drawing of Amenhotep IV is copied from a scene in the Theban tomb of Ramose, Amenhotep III's vizier, who continued on into the first few years of Amenhotep IV's reign. Amenhotep IV chose as his throne name Nefer, beautiful, Khepru, manifestation of Ra, Wa-en, unique one, of Ra. In other words, the beautiful manifestation of Ra, unique one of Ra. This statue of Amenhotep IV is now in the Louvre Museum. While ruling from Karnak, Amenhotep IV completed the decorations on the third pylon built by his father, added a courtyard in front of the temple dedicated to his wife, Nefertiti, and just east of the precinct of Amun, he also added 4 temples dedicated to the Aten. For reasons not known, the new king also adopted a strange new art style known as Amarna Period art. Various theories have been put forth, but we really don't know why he did it. In the 5th year of his reign, about 1348 BCE, Amenhotep IV changed his birth name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, which means Ak-en, useful to Aten. In other words, useful to the Aten. His throne name, Nefer Khepru Ra Wa-en Ra, was not changed. The Aten had been worshipped for some time, but Akhenaten elevated him to be his chief god, turning his back on Amun, the chief god of the 18th dynasty kings before him. The Aten was a solar deity, portrayed as a disk, with hands at the end of its rays. Here, Akhenaten is shown as a human-headed sphinx. Notice the ray that ends near his nose is holding an ankh, the symbol of life. The left cartouche is the name of Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti. The 2 small cartouches in the center are Akhenaten's birth and throne names, and the 2 large cartouches to the right are the titles of the Aten. Not only did Akhenaten change his name and reject the old god Amun, he moved Egypt's capital from Thebes, 170 miles north, to virgin ground at Amarna in Middle Egypt. Amarna is the modern name for the site of Akhenaten city, which he called Akhet, horizon of Aten. or Akhenaten. The city lies on the east bank of the Nile, mostly built on dry desert land. Akhenaten occupies a space between the cliffs about 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. It's traversed by a main road called the Royal Road, which ran from north to south through the city. Other tracks through the desert led to various settlements, workshops, cemeteries, and tombs. Egyptologist John Darnell says, and I quote, "At Akhenaten, the daily activities of the royal family replaced all of the great festivals of Egypt. The layout of Akhenaten functioned as an enormous stage, upon which Akhenaten and his family each morning would mount their chariots and hurtle along the royal road into the central city." End quote. To mark off the boundaries of his new city, Akhenaten placed 16 large markers called Stelae around Amarna. They were carved in the 5th and 6th year of his reign. The Stelae described how Akhenaten planned to build a city here, which he would dedicate to the Aten, and how he would construct a royal tomb for himself, Nefertiti, and his oldest daughter, Meritaten. These boundary stelae are now designated by capital letters, with gaps left for future discoveries. Here's a photo of boundary stela N, taken in 1908. This reconstruction shows how it originally looked. It's located on the southern cliffs near the Maru Aten. It was erected in year 6, and it shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti making offerings to the Aten. On each side of the stela are rock-carved statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and 2 of their daughters, Meritaten and Aten. Shortly after Akhenaten's death, the next king, Tutankhamun, abandoned the city, only a dozen or so years after it was built. King Tut moved back to Thebes and reinstated Amun as the chief god of Egypt. Then, about 15 years later, in 1320 BCE, Pharaoh Horemheb tore down Akhenaten's buildings at both Thebes and Amarna, destroyed his statues, and purged Akhenaten from the written record. How dare he? To get to know the city better, let's go on a walking tour. This will help understanding the tomb scenes I'll show later. Here's a map of our walk from north to south through the city. Travelers arriving by boat from Lower Egypt would dock at the north end. The first building encountered was the North Riverside Palace. Across the Royal Road lay the buildings of the North City. A little to the south lay the North Palace, and south of it, the North Suburb. The central city was the administrative and religious hub, with its small and great Aten temples, great palace, king's house, and other administrative buildings. Just south of the central city is the main city with numerous houses, workshops, and stables. The south suburb had more residences and estates. And finally, at the southern end were the Qom el-Nana and the Maru Aten temples. So our walking tour begins at the north end of the city by boundary stela X. Above is a reconstruction of the North Riverside Palace, which fronted the Royal Road. The panel below was found near the entry gate. It's part of a painted scene showing the top of a cartouche of the king's birth name, Akhenaten, prefixed with Sa-Ra, or son of Ra. And the top of the B hieroglyph beside it shows that underneath would have also been the king's throne name, Nefer Keperu Ra, Wa, and Ra. Above is a modern view of the gate of the North Riverside Palace. Below are excavation photographs taken in 1923. The bottom left picture shows the palace was originally surrounded by a double wall with a wide empty space in between. The outer wall was buttressed with square towers, and it ran for over half a mile along the Royal Road. But most of this palace has been lost due to an eastern shift in the channel of the Nile and modern cultivation of the riverbank. Across the Royal Road from the North Riverside Palace, and just south of the houses of the North City, was another palace called the North Palace. It was a large structure, 466 feet long by 367 feet wide. Here's a reconstruction of what it originally looked like. The North Palace contained a large entry court, a central pool, a sunken garden, a sun chapel, a throne room, and a bedroom with a private bath. This is a view of the North Palace today. Inscriptions show it had originally been made for one of Akhenaten's secondary wives, Tiye. It was later converted into a palace for Akhenaten's oldest daughter, Meritaten. Little to the south of the houses of the north suburb was the central city. Akhenaten's administrative area. Within this enclave were the Great Aten Temple, the Great Palace, the Small Aten Temple, a building called the King's House, a study library called the House of Life, the records office where the Amarna Letters were found, and the police barracks and stables. This area was surrounded by desert, and it would not have looked as green as on this map. The Great Aten Temple consisted of two main parts, the main building, now called the Long Temple, and a pavilion located 984 feet to the east. The two structures were enclosed by a huge wall, 2,625 feet long by 984 feet wide. Here's a short video of the Great Aten Temple, created for an exhibition in Lille, France in 2017. So as we fly through, we'll go through the entry pylons. Each side of the temple was surrounded by hundreds of offering tables, which wasn't put in this view. We enter the first courtyard and then start to go through numerous sets of pylons as we go in through the various chambers of the temple. And finally, at the end, we reach a sanctuary. And then traveling to the pavilion a little further to the east, it's an open roof temple as well, dedicated for the sun. And it contains numerous rooms, storage chambers, and a sanctuary. And finally, at the back is the notch in the cliffs that Akhenaten defined Amarna by. The Great Aten Temple was constructed with talatat blocks, 21 inches long by 10 inches wide by 10 inches deep. They were created so that a single man could lift and carry them. This block, found by Flinders Petrie and Howard Carter, shows 16 of the Aten Temple's hundreds of offering tables piled high with flowers, bread loaves, and dishes of burning incense. The trussed cattle below are waiting to be sacrificed. The Great Aten Temple's walls and talatat scenes were later carted away, and today only the foundations of the buildings remain. The temple is surrounded by these hundreds of mud brick offering tables, probably erected by Amarna citizens to conduct funeral services. This photo of them was taken in 1932. Just south of the Great Aten Temple, and across the Royal Road on the side by the river, was Akhenaten's Great Palace, a building that was probably mostly used for ceremonial purposes. Entering the building from the north, a huge forecourt was encountered which had a window of appearance where the king could be viewed by his subjects. Here's an excavation photo of the Great Palace taken in 1934, and here's what it looks like today. Petrie erected a protective building over the Great Palace's painted floors, which were later moved to the Cairo Museum. Here's a close-up of the marsh plants and a duck painted on the floor. This is the Great Palace as seen in the tomb of Meryre I, the high priest of the Aten. You can clearly see the window of appearance looking out in the forecourt, and the audience hall behind, and in the upper left corner an apartment for the king, complete with a bedroom. Here's a reconstruction of Akhenaten looking out at the window of appearance. It was from the window of appearance that Akhenaten dispensed awards, as is shown in this scene. Here he is rewarding Ai, overseer of His Majesty's horses, with gold collars. This tradition has continued into modern times, but alas, now the Pope only showers the Vatican crowd with blessings and not gold. At Amarna, behind the window of appearance, in the palace's audience hall, Akhenaten and Nefertiti would receive guests, gift, and tribute on their loggia, a kind of porch. In this scene from the tomb of Meryre II, overseer of the Treasury, Akhenaten is receiving tribute from foreign dignitaries. He's seated on his throne inside a baldachin, or covered canopy, on the loggia in his palace. Here's a reconstruction of a loggia and baldachin, with thrones for both Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and the symbol of the Aten behind them. It's based on the remains of an actual structure in Amenhotep III's Melkata Palace. Ancient Egyptian tradition of using a loggia and baldachin has also continued into modern times. Here, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip visit Canada. Across a bridge from the Great Palace was another building that modern excavators have called the King's House. However, its layout is better suited to offices and meeting rooms than a house for the king. So instead, it was probably the place where the king's men conducted regular business with each other. In addition, access to the Great Palace could be controlled and guarded via the bridge. So anyone requesting an audience with the king could be vetted at this building before being allowed into the Great Palace. The king's house also included a garden and a large number of storerooms. A painted plaster wall showing Akhenaten's daughters was found in the king's house. Here is the painted wall, now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. His three older daughters, Meritaten, Aten, Nakhtpaaten, are shown standing in front of a seated Nefertiti. The next two younger daughters, Nefernefer-Ure and Nefernefer-Aten Tasheret, are shown seated on a cushion. Just east of the king's house was a group of administrative buildings and storage magazines. Two of the buildings were particularly important: the House of Life, where important scrolls were copied and kept, and the Records Office, which archived correspondence between Egypt and foreign states. 382 clay tablets called the Amarna Letters were found in the Records Office. They were in Akkadian, the language of international diplomacy at that time, written in cuneiform script. This tablet was written to Akhenaten by vassal king Abi-Milku of Tyre, asking for troops to help guard his city from attack. The Amarna Letters came from Babylon and Assyria, Mitanni and the Hittites, Arzawa and Elishia, Syria and Lebanon, and Canaan. Just south of the king's house was another temple dedicated to the Aten. Now called the Small Aten Temple, it was oriented toward a notch in the cliffs where the royal wadi enters the Amarna Plain. British graphics artist Paul Docherty has researched the alignment of the temple and discovered that during the spring and fall equinoxes, the sun rises through a notch in the cliffs. This meant that during the equinox, Akhenaten would see the sun emerge from the wadi leading up to his royal tomb. It was probably very symbolic. So he would have seen something like this. Barry Kemp has placed new blocks over the old gypsum foundations, so visitors to Amarna can see how the floor plan of the temple was laid out. Just south of the central city are the houses and workshops in the main city of Amarna. Although most are now covered with sand, the column bases and mud brick walls still show the layout of these buildings. The large estates in the city also had houses and workshops of craftsmen surrounding them. The estate owners probably supervised the workers living beside them. Owners like the sculptor Thutmose, whose adjacent workshop was found by Ludwig Borchardt in 1912. Here, Barry Kemp points out the find spot, the head of Nefertiti, from Thutmose's workshop. A little to the south of the main city were the houses and estates of the south suburb. This reconstruction of its buildings is by French artist Jean-Claude Gauvin. Pretty cool looking. Just past the houses in the south suburb is a structure now called the Kam el Nana. It was the sunshade temple of Nefertiti. Here's a depiction of the sunshade temple of Queen Tiye, Akhenaten's mother, from the tomb of Huya, Queen Tiye's steward. Sunshades were open-roof temples dedicated to a solar deity, which in this case was the Aten. Meritaten's sunshade, the Maru Aten, was located just south of the Kam el Nana in a huge complex of buildings and pools. The most important building here was the Sunshade Chapel. This is a reconstruction of Meritaten's Sunshade Chapel in the Maru Aten. The right sidewall has been removed in this cutout view to show the interior of the chapel. And this is a close-up view of the Maru Aten as depicted in the city model at the Amarna Visitors Center. Meritaten's Sunshade Chapel is located here. Here's what the Maru Aten looked like when it was excavated in 1923. But in the 1960s, the site was completely destroyed when the Egyptian government plowed it under to create an irrigated watermelon patch, which was later abandoned when it was found to be unprofitable. Returning north via the desert, we first encounter the rock-cut south tombs, and alongside them is the South Workers' Cemetery. A little to the north is the large walled compound of the workmen's village. Nearby is the stone village, where the tomb builders lived next to the royal wadi. 4 miles up the royal wadi were the royal tombs. Continuing to the north are the rock-cut north tombs and the North Workers' Cemetery. Behind the north tombs ran a valley with a dozen limestone quarries. And finally, near the north end of the city, the desert altars. So continuing our walking tour northwards from the Meritaten, you first encounter the south tombs. There are 19 tombs in the southern group, numbered 7 through 25. The owners of 6 are not known. Most of these nobles' tombs are only partly completed, and none appear to have been sealed and used. Included in the southern group is number 25, the unused tomb of Ai, who would of course later follow King Tut as pharaoh, and ultimately be buried in the Valley of the Kings. A short distance up the wadi between tombs 24 and 25 is the South Workers' Cemetery. This cemetery contains over 6,000 graves. It was excavated between 2007 and 2013. Many skeletons showed evidence of hard labor and diseases such as malaria. Proceeding northwards, the next site encountered is the workmen's village. Like the village of Deir el-Medina, the Amarna workmen's village was the home to artisans who decorated the royal and nobles' tombs. First excavated in the 1920s, 73 homes were discovered inside a walled compound next to several larger buildings and chapels. There's a reconstruction of the walled workmen's village. And this is a cross-section of one of the homes, number 9 Gate Street, found inside the compound with its own altar. And here's a reconstruction of one of the workmen's village chapels, excavated in 1923. It's interesting that amulets and other votive objects found in the village show that its inhabitants worshipped a variety of gods, and not just the Aten. This chapel was dedicated to Shed, the god of salvation. A short distance to the east of the workmen's village are the ruins of another compound called the Stone Village. It's situated near the mouth of the Royal Wadi, and it contains a high density of residential buildings. Barry Kemp has speculated it was the residence of the laborers connected with the excavation of the Amarna tombs. The royal tomb is located 4 miles up the Royal Wadi. Tombs at Amarna are numbered with a Tiye prefix, standing for Tomb Amarna. Although there are 3 other undecorated tombs nearby, only the royal tomb, Tiye 26, was prepared to receive Akhenaten and Nefertiti's burial. When discovered in modern times, it was empty. This is the entrance passageway of the royal tomb. Like other tombs at Amarna, it seems to have been heavily damaged. Akhenaten and Nefertiti's second daughter, Aten, predeceased the king, and she seems to have been buried in a side chamber of the royal tomb. Akhenaten's sarcophagus was also found in the tomb, smashed into little tiny pieces. Its remains have been partially reassembled, and when I was last in Cairo, the sarcophagus was on display along the outside of the Egyptian Museum. Near the northeast perimeter of Amarna are the rock-cut north tombs. Although there's only 6 tombs here, they represent the best preserved of the elite members of Akhenaten's royal court. A short distance up the wadi between tombs 2 and 3 is the North Workers' Cemetery. This cemetery contains over 4,000 graves. The individuals buried here not only show the same stress injuries as those buried in the South Workers' Cemetery. What is shocking is that 90% were between the ages of 8 and 20 years old. They seem to have been Akhenaten's child labor force. Just behind the rock cliffs at the north end of Amarna were several limestone quarries, like the one shown here, which was found by Flinders Petrie with the name of Queen Tiye inscribed inside. These are the quarries that produced the Talatat blocks used at Amarna. We'll end our walking tour at the desert altars, near the north suburb where we started. Joined by a pathway to the north tombs, these altars seem to have been somehow connected with their burials. There are 3 platforms accessed by a series of ramps. The platforms have cutout areas on them to support columns and an obelisk, but little else is known about them. So now that you're more familiar with the city of Akhenaten, let's look at the people who lived there, beginning with the royal family. Here's a colossal statue of Akhenaten's parents, Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. Queen Tiye lived well into Akhenaten's reign. She had a palace at Memphis and is thought to have had a residence at Amarna. Akhenaten had at least 3 wives: chief wife Nefertiti, left; secondary wives Kiya, top right; and Tadu Kippa, bottom right. In a scene inscribed in Akhenaten's year 12, all 6 of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters are shown: Meritaten, Aten, Ankh-Esenpaaten, Nefer Aten Tesheret, Nefer Ure, and Setep and Re. Smenkhare was probably Akhenaten's oldest son, but then maybe not. The mummy found in tomb KV55 may be Smenkhare, but perhaps not. Tutankhamun was probably also Akhenaten's younger son, but then again, maybe not. Tut's parents are known with certainty through DNA analysis of 2 of the royal mummies, but Egyptologists are not really sure who these mummies are. And without Akhenaten and Nefertiti's mummies, it cannot be determined who were the parents of Smenkhare or Tutankhamun, unless, of course, more written information is found. Here's a list of officials who met the king on a regular basis. In the next section, I'll go through these positions one by one. Barry Kemp points out that the court was not a top-down hierarchy, but a parallel group of responsible officials who delegated downward and then reported upward directly to the king. Viziers were the most important officials of the king. They were called jati in ancient Egyptian. They were in charge of running the country. There were normally 2 viziers, one in the north in Lower Egypt and the other in the south in Upper Egypt. They had multiple responsibilities and were in charge of tax collection, holding the high court, security, supervising the official scribes, ensuring the food supply, monitoring the king's building projects, and overseeing foreign trade. During the New Kingdom, it was recorded that viziers met daily with the king. 3 viziers are known from Akhenaten's reign: Aperel, Ramose, and Nakhtpaaten. Aperel was Akhenaten's vizier of the north, based at Memphis. His name is Semitic, meaning the servant of the god El, so he may have come from Palestine or Syria. He was previously vizier of the north under Amenhotep III, and he's only known vizier of the north under Akhenaten. He was buried along with his wife Teweret and son Huya, who was a commander of chariots, in tomb I-1 at Saqqara. Ramose was vizier of the south under Amenhotep III, and he continued on into the early reign of Akhenaten. His tomb at Thebes has artwork in both traditional and Amarna styles. Ramose probably died and was buried at Thebes during Akhenaten's first 5 years, while he was ruling there as Amenhotep IV. Nakhtpaaten became vizier of the south after Ramose died, and he built an undecorated tomb, Tiye 12, in the south tombs at Amarna. Nakhtpaaten's other titles included Overseer of Works at Akhenaten and Overseer of the City. These show he worked his way up through important positions before becoming vizier. In this scene in the tomb of the chief of police, Mahu, Nakhtpaaten, shown by the blue arrow, is approached by Mahu, red arrow, who presents 3 bound prisoners for judgment. In the text, Mahu says, and I quote, "Let the officials hear from these prisoners, who would join those of the desert hills and cause trouble for the city," end quote. And here's an overlay of Nakhtpaaten as he now appears on Mahu's tomb wall. Nakhtpaaten's large house was identified by inscriptions on its walls. It had offices, reception halls, several bedrooms, a room with a bathtub on a raised platform, and a lavatory with a toilet. The photo at the top is of the entry hall, and the drawing on the bottom right is of the central court. The interior walls of the vizier's house were whitewashed, with colored friezes along the top. The ceiling was painted blue, and the floor was plastered and painted in bright colors of red and yellow. Nakhtpaaten's 3-story house had 30 rooms spread out over 8,500 square feet. It was big. With shaded gardens and ponds, the large estate at Amarna would have been very comfortable places to relax after returning from working in the central city. Nakhtpaaten's place of work, the house of the vizier, was probably the building misnamed the House of the King by modern excavators. It was richly decorated, and it provided offices, meeting rooms, and storerooms. In addition, it was adjacent to the Records Office and the House of Life, which stored important foreign correspondence and administrative documents. The king had so many duties that day-to-day religious matters were delegated to a high priest, called the Hem Necher Tepi in ancient Egyptian, literally chief priest of the god. He was probably the most important official after the viziers. Another term used during the Amarna period for the high priest was the greatest of seers of the Aten. He was responsible for running the temples at Akhenaten and probably elsewhere. But since there was no god statue to care for, the high priest's duties may have been limited to reciting prayers and managing the distribution of offerings. In fact, not much is known about Akhenaten's concept of life after death, or how an Atenist mortuary cult would have functioned. Meryre I was high priest of the Aten at Akhenaten. He also held the titles Royal Chancellor, Fan Bearer on the right of the king, Sole Companion, and Friend of the king. In this scene from his tomb, Meryre, Blue Arrow, is shown being proclaimed high priest by Akhenaten, Black Arrow, from his window of appearance. Then afterwards, Meryre, shown by the Red Arrow, is carried jubilantly by his supporters. Just above him, 4 scribes, shown by the Green Arrow, record the event as it happens. Above is a panorama picture of Meryre I's tomb, and below are close-ups of its pillars. In this scene, Meryre I is rewarded while the king, Nefertiti, and 2 daughters look on. This close-up shows Meryre I, Blue Arrow, being adorned with gold collars by Meryre II, Red Arrow, the supervisor of the treasury. This event is also recorded by 4 scribes, shown by the Green Arrow. In another scene in Meryre I's tomb, Akhenaten and Nefertiti arrive at the great Aten temple in their chariots, accompanied by an escort of running soldiers, and the king and queen are followed behind by a retinue of officials in their own chariots. Notice also on the top left is a depiction of the great palace, which the entourage has just left. Remember the scene I showed before where I described the great palace? And here's how the chariot scene looks today. When they arrive at the great Aten temple, it's shown in detail. Depicted are the entry pylons and gate, hundreds of offering tables, temple storerooms, and an outlying shrine at the back of the temple enclosure. Here's a close-up of the multitude of offerings laid out in the great Aten temple. Gathering up and laying out the offerings and then distributing them afterwards would have kept Meryre and his retinue of priests very busy indeed. Left, as depicted in this tomb, is a plan of a large estate. Daguerreotypes Davies proposed it was Meryre I's house. Behind the house, it even has a shadoof beside its well. As you can see from the 3D view on the right, this estate was very palatial. If you're not familiar with a shadoof, it's a water bucket that could be raised with a counterweighted pole. Overseer of the 2 treasuries is Imi Ar Per Heju. In ancient Egyptian, Imi Ar is overseer, Per means house, Hej is the treasury, and Heju is the 2 treasuries. An overseer in ancient Egypt was a supervisor of a task or group of people. An overseer could be a first-level supervisor, like the foreman of a quarry gang, or a high-level official such as a mayor, who was called overseer of the city. The treasury was the place where valuable goods were stored, like gold, silver, cloth, wine, beer, and grain. And remember, in a barter economy, trade goods function just like money. Another Meryre at Amarna was the overseer of the 2 treasuries. To tell the 2 Meryres apart, Egyptologists have named them Meryre I and Meryre II. Meryre II also listed his titles as royal scribe and overseer of the royal harem of Nefertiti. The picture on the left, he's receiving gold collars from the king. And on the right is a drawing of one of the treasuries packed with bread, wine, beer, and gold. It isn't known, though, if the 2 treasuries meant one in the north of the country and one in the south, or one for the temple and the other for the state. Here's a view toward the niche in Meryre II's tomb. An important scene in Meryre II's tomb shows foreign dignitaries bringing tribute and gifts to Akhenaten, who is seated in his loggia. Behind his throne, all 6 daughters are shown. This scene is dated to year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. The celebration is termed by Egyptologists a Durbar, after the name of a public reception held by a prince in India. Egyptologist Campbell Price speculates that plague brought into Egypt by the foreign visitors at the Durbar may have caused the subsequent death of many at Akhenaten's court, and perhaps even the downfall of the Amarna period itself. In another scene from Meryre II's tomb, Nefertiti pours a libation for Akhenaten, assisted by 3 of their daughters. An interesting and very unique scene in Meryre II's tomb is that of Meryre II giving praise to Akhenaten's co-ruling king, Smenkhare, with his wife Meritaten, who was also Akhenaten's oldest daughter. Police and security guards are frequently depicted in Amarna tombs. Medjay, similar to our secret service, guard the pharaoh, and Shena, policemen, protect the city. These men were paramilitary, looking like and probably trained as soldiers, sort of an ancient Egyptian national guard. There are scenes of police sentries guarding the perimeter of the city, and both the Medjay and Shena carry weapons like axes, spears, swords, and bows. And surprisingly, their ranks included mercenaries from Libya, Nubia, and Syria. Mahu, shown in the left picture, praising the Aten, was the chief of police at Akhenaten. The police guarded the city, watched the tombs, and protected the king. In the right-hand picture, Mahu is inspecting his troops, who guard an outpost in the desert, warmed by a burning brazier fire. This scene shows Mahu in his chariot, preceding the king's entourage. Here, Mahu proclaims to the king, and I quote, "You make my troops great, and by my troops, ruler of Akhenaten, you shall live forever." End quote. Wooden standards depicting various police units, shown on the right, were found in the sanctuary of the main chapel of the Great Aten Temple. Here, Mahu is shown inspecting goods in the temple storerooms. One of his most important duties was guarding the storerooms of the pharaoh. This is the ruins of the police quarters, where Mahu supervised Amarna's security. As can be seen in this aerial view, the police quarters had a stable attached for horses and chariots. Nefer Keperu her Sekeper means Nefer Keperu, that is Akhenaten, causes me to live. Called the mayor of Akhenaten by Egyptologists, his actual title was governor of Akhenaten, Heka, governor, Nuiti of the city of Akhenaten. His tomb was unfinished and undecorated, but it was skillfully carved. The stewards of the various palaces were called the Emir, overseer, of the Perewer, or great house. Modern Egyptologists sometimes refer to them as chief stewards or high stewards. They were responsible for palace and harem administration, and for provisioning the palaces. Additional duties of the stewards was overseeing the palace workshops. Huya was the steward of the house of Queen Tiye, Akhenaten's mother. Probably under Amenhotep III, he also held titles of treasurer and supervisor of the harem. Queen Tiye's mummy was recently identified via hair samples and DNA from the elder lady found in a side chamber of Amenhotep II's tomb. Her hair was also in a box labeled with her name, found in King Tut's tomb. In the left scene, Huya is praising the hymn to the Aten, which may have been written by Akhenaten himself. This photo from Huya's tomb looks toward his rock-cut Ka statue. In another scene from Huya's tomb, Akhenaten leads Queen Tiye through the Great Aten Temple. It may be the remote pavilion on the eastern edge of the Great Aten Temple was the sunshade temple dedicated to Queen Tiye. Here's a detailed view of the side of the Great Aten Temple shown in the previous slide. Along the sides of the temple were colossal statues, alternating between images of Akhenaten, Amenhotep III, and Queen Tiye. The remains of these smashed statues were found by Petrie during his excavation in 1891. In this scene, Akhenaten and Nefertiti socialize with Queen Tiye, attended by Huya and watched by Queen Tiye's daughter, Aten, and Akhenaten's daughters, Meritaten and Aten. And in this unusual scene in Huya's tomb, he's a deceased mummy, being mourned and given offerings. Ipi was royal scribe and steward of the great house of the king, which probably was the North Riverside Palace. His tomb was only partially finished with an offering scene, one prayer, and the shorter version of the hymn to the Aten. The offering scene is dated to around year 9 of Akhenaten's reign. Viziers oversaw the storage of grain, surplus grain based on the height of the Nile flood, but cities and palaces also had their own overseers of food distribution. These included the overseer of grain and the overseer of cattle, who monitored and distributed food locally. While grain could be stored and then later drawn upon, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and fish had to be harvested on demand, since there was no refrigeration. There were animal pens in Amarna, and vegetables were grown on farms across the river. A large bakery was located in the central city, and broken bread molds litter the site today. In Egyptian, a seal bearer is Het-Emti, and Biti is an abbreviation for the king of Lower Egypt. So Het-Emti Biti is the seal bearer of the king of Lower Egypt. Seal impressions were used to mark possessions and secure correspondence. Top right is a seal of Akhenaten, left side, portrayed as the god Shu. The figure on the right side represents Nefertiti. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. Bottom right is a seal of Akhenaten with his throne name, Nefer Keperu Ra Wa En Ra. The wear marks on this seal suggest it's been used extensively. It's also in the Metropolitan Museum. Top left is a seal on an Amarna wine jar, and bottom left is a folded and sealed papyrus. Panehesy was superintendent of both cattle and the granary at Akhenaten. His other titles included seal bearer of the king of Lower Egypt, second prophet of the Lord of the Two Lands, and chief servitor of the Aten. The difference between a chief servitor and a high priest is not known. Perhaps Meryre I as high priest served at the great Aten temple, while Panehesy was chief servitor at a lesser Aten temple. Or possibly Panehesy reported to Meryre I. We just don't know. In this scene, Panehesy is shown reciting a prayer to the Aten. Here's a picture of the inside of Panehesy's tomb. Panehesy had two buildings with his name on them. One, shown here, was his residence in the central city, house number R44.2. It was a large estate, beside which was a village, whose residents probably worked for Panehesy. Here's a reconstruction of Panehesy's city house. In Panehesy's city house was found a votive stela, dedicated to Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, done in the Amarna style. Amenhotep's name is listed as his throne name, Neb Ma'at Ra, so as not to pollute Amarna with the name of Amun. The other building attributed to Panehesy was his office, next to the great Aten temple. It was located beside cattle pens, supporting Panehesy's title as the overseer of cattle. And here is where the huge Amarna bakery was located, which, along with brewing beer, was where the grain Panehesy oversaw was used. Within Panehesy's office was found a large shrine painted to look like an Amarna temple. It originally had wooden doors, and it likely held a statue of the king. Called chancellors by modern Egyptologists, in ancient Egyptian they were Imi Ar Hetmet, literally overseers of sealed things. They were the main administrator of the royal belongings, in other words, the king's accountant. Left is a grain storage jar, center is a beer jar, and right is a wine jar. In ancient Egyptian, fan bearer of the king was Jahu Her Wenemi Nesut, literally translated as bearer of fan in sight of the right hand of the king. Fan bearer was an important title in ancient Egypt, partly because it shaded and cooled the king, and partly because the fan bearer had very close access to Pharaoh. Also because the fan created moving air, was a symbol of breathing and therefore of life itself. Fan bearers are depicted in most Amarna tomb scenes. Ahmes was royal chancellor, fan bearer on the right of the king, superintendent of the courthouse, and steward of the estate of Akhenaten. Here he's portrayed with two of his insignias of office slung over his shoulder, his fan signifying he was a fan bearer for the king, and a military axe showing his command over a company of soldiers. Here's a storage building shown in an Amarna tomb. Notice the beer, wine, and grain storage jars that Ahmes, as Chancellor, would have kept account of. He would also have kept track, of course, where the king and queen's jewelry was stored. This scene shows a bugler, Blue Arrow, calling Ahmes' company of soldiers, who run in front of the royal chariot, which I'll show on the next slide. The mercenary foreign troops in the squad include a bearded Syrian, Black Arrow, and 2 bowmen, a Nubian, Green Arrow, and a Libyan, Red Arrow. In a very unusual scene in Ahmes' tomb, Akhenaten and Nefertiti kiss, and the Aten hands them the Ankh of life while galloping along behind the soldiers seen in the previous slide. And look, one of the daughters peeks over the rim of the chariot at the horses. This is an unfinished statue of Ahmes found in his tomb. Royal Butler was Depu Nesu, literally butler of the king in ancient Egyptian. The royal butler looked after the day-to-day needs of the king and his family, much like a modern butler. But, in addition, they accompanied the king to the battlefield and negotiated for him with foreign dignitaries. Wow! I hope Pharaoh had a butler as good as P.G. Woodhouse's Jeeves. Parennefer, the king's royal butler, also held the title Craftsman of the King and Washer of the King's Hands. In this scene, detailed below, Parennefer, Blue Arrow, is shown being awarded gold by the king from his window of appearance. And on the far left, Akhenaten's daughters, Red Arrow, and Nefertiti's sister, Green Arrow, watch the event. Here's a close-up from the previous slide of the 3 oldest daughters, and Nefertiti's sister, Mut Benret, who was standing behind the king. In this scene, Parennefer recites a prayer to the Aten. In ancient Egyptian, physician was Siwenu. Egyptian medicine often used magic spells, as listed on the magical papyri of London and Leiden. Surgical procedures and tools are discussed in the Edmund Smith papyrus, and herbs in the Ebers papyrus. The Amarna letter from the king of Ugarit asked Akhenaten to send him an Egyptian physician, as they were highly regarded in Egypt's vassal states. Penthu's titles included chief physician, chancellor, royal scribe, intimate of the king, and chief servitor of the Aten. Physicians in ancient Egypt used a combination of practical skills such as herbal treatments and surgeries, and sympathetic magic, which was thought to enhance medical treatments. Shown here, Penthu receives gold collars, recorded by the usual 4 scribes above. Penthu's tomb scenes are now badly damaged. This scene shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti in their chariot. Horses were probably not introduced into Egypt by the Hyksos. That's a myth. A horse skeleton dated from the Middle Kingdom was found at Buhin, and Salima Akram has also identified a chariot harness from the Old Kingdom. And it's documented the Egyptians fought the Hyksos when they arrived with horse-drawn chariots of their own design. Only a few tomb scenes show horses being ridden, however. Almost all show them pulling chariots. The horse shown here is the handle of a New Kingdom whip, now in the Metropolitan Museum. At Amarna, pairs of horses were used to pull chariots. In the 18th dynasty, kings and elite members of the court used chariots for transportation, and of course they were used in warfare. On the bottom left is a chariot actually preserved from the Amarna period. It was of course found in King Tut's tomb. I, who was Akhenaten's overseer of horses at Amarna, would later become pharaoh following Tutankhamun. His other titles included Father of the Divine One, perhaps Nefertiti, acting scribe of the king, fan bearer on the right of the king, and head of the companions of the king. In this scene, I recites a prayer to the Aten. In the scene below from his tomb, I and his wife Tiye are shown inside the great palace, where I is rewarded with gold by Akhenaten. The top part of the same scene, shown above, soldiers are guarding the outside of the great palace. The ramps behind them are signaling platforms. 2 regiments are shown, one with square and the other with fan-shaped standards. The text records the soldiers' conversations. The sentry nearest the gate asks a street boy, "For whom is this rejoicing being made?" And the boy answered, "The rejoicing is for I and his wife Tiye. They have been made people of gold." And the man sitting in front of the 3rd sentry tells him, "Pharaoh has given them millions in gold and all manner of riches." And of course afterwards, I can't resist showing his gold hoard to his friends. In this scene from his tomb, I and Tiye venerate the long form of the hymn to the Aten. I's version of the hymn is the one most often quoted. And this is a photo of the pillared hall in I's unused Amarna tomb. Not much is known about Parennefer, the master of horses, except that he had a large house at Amarna. This photo shows the round grain storage silos located behind his house. They were excavated by the EES in the 1920s. This is a reconstruction of Parennefer's house, number N49.18. You can visit a life-size partial reconstruction of his house at the Amarna Visitors Center. During the New Kingdom, the military was divided into the infantry, chariotry, and the navy. Each division was commanded by a general who had both command and administrative duties. Command responsibilities included fortress and outpost garrisoning, and foreign incursions and occupation. And administrative responsibilities included troop training, procuring equipment, provisioning, and the planning and construction of forts. One of the most respected titles in ancient Egypt was sesh, scribe. It denoted a person who was able to read and write. Royal scribes were denoted by adding the nasut symbol, signifying the king, after the scribal title. Royal scribes were especially important as they had access to members of the royal court and composed and read important documents dictated by the king and his officials. At Amarna, some of the royal scribes worked in the records office in the House of Life, where they studied and stored important correspondence. Other royal scribes met with the king and his ministers to record and distribute decrees to officials in Egypt and beyond. Ramose, an army general at Amarna, not the Ramose who was Akhenaten's old vizier at Thebes, had a house in the main city. This Ramose had formerly been a steward under Amenhotep III, and he listed another of his titles as royal scribe. General Ramose's house was identified by inscriptions on its door jamb. Ramose's large house has been digitally reconstructed. The construction and administration of Akhenaten city required many other supervisors and officials who were not important enough for a rock-cut tomb. At Amarna, these individuals were buried in the South Workers' Cemetery. They were often wrapped in simple reed mats with a few grave goods, and a few were interred in wooden coffins like this one, placed in pits in the sand. The overseer of works was Imi-ar-Khat, an ancient Egyptian. On-site supervision of each project was carried out by an overseer of work, for example, in temple construction. But the overseer of all works of the king was a high-level official who juggled all of the projects that Pharaoh had going within his realm. In this case, just add the hieroglyph for king to suit after the overseer of work title. These were important positions in order to get the city of Akhenaten built in only a couple of years. Aidan Dodson believes there was so much work required in the city, there was not enough manpower to work on the tombs before Amarna was abandoned. Hence, many of the tombs were left unfinished. Tutu's titles included Overseer of all works of the king, Chamberlain, Overseer of silver and gold, and Chief Servitor of the Aten. He's also mentioned in a Amarna letter from Azaru, king of Canaan. Tutu's tomb is one of the largest of the nobles' tombs at Amarna. Like today, being the overseer of all the king's works has its privileges. There's a detail on one of Tutu's columns. Tiye was an on-site overseer of work at Amarna. House number T34.1 in the north suburb belonged to Tiye, whose title on his door lintel, shown here, said he was chief builder. Tiye would have supervised much of the construction at Amarna and probably reported to Akhenaten's overseer of all the king's works, Tutu. Tiye's large home also had a private altar in the back. Private altars were common at Amarna. Artists and sculptors were called Hemwu and Sank by the ancient Egyptians, and these craftsmen were highly regarded. Hemwu is a contraction of the words for skillful, Hemu, and work, Hemwi. This term was equally applied to both artisans and artists. Sank, sculptor, is a contraction of the words, he is giving it life. This picture of craftsman is from the tomb of Nebamu, an official scribe under Amenhotep III and IV. On this stela found at Aswan, Bek, red arrow, venerates Akhenaten, while his father, Men, blue arrow, venerates Amenhotep III. On the stela, sculptor Beck claims he was the apprentice whom Akhenaten taught to create the new Amarna style of art. Beck, by the way, means worker in the ancient Egyptian language. While at Aswan, Beck supervised the quarrying of the stone he would later use to carve the colossal statues of Akhenaten, Amenhotep III, and Tiye, placed in the great Aten temples both at Karnak and Amarna. I already mentioned Thutmose the sculptor and the discovery of the bust of Nefertiti, but Thutmose's workshop contained many other sculptures, like the three heads shown in this slide, and a small statue of an aging woman, perhaps Nefertiti. The final person I'll mention tonight is the sculptor Iuti. This scene from the tomb of Huya shows Iuti creating a statue of Aten, the young daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. As I previously mentioned, sculptor in ancient Egyptian is Sank, which translates as he is giving it, that is the statue, life. It's kind of interesting. Now let's move on to a summary of the modern excavators of the city of Amarna. Amarna was first mapped and drawn by the Napoleonic expedition in 1798. John Gardner Wilkinson explored the city in 1824. Robert Hay recorded the tomb reliefs in 1833. Lepsius visited in 1843 and 1845. The Amarna Letters were found in 1877. The royal tomb was discovered in 1891. Petrie excavated in 1892. Daguerre Davies did tomb drawings between 1903 to 1908. Borchardt excavated in 1907 to 1914. Peat, Woolley, and Pendlebury excavated in 1921 to 1936. And Barry Kemp has had ongoing excavations since 1977. So what would it have been like to live in Akhenaten? Monuments were going up rapidly, homes were being built, the desert was being transformed, and a new god was in town. The king, queen, and royal princesses were frequently seen driving their chariots along the royal road. Artisans and workmen were busy, officials were occupied with affairs of state, and the elite had huge estates. Life was good. But like other cities in the ancient world, there was much inequality. Slaves worked in the mines and quarries, farmers were heavily taxed, and children seem to have been forced into hard labor. It was a golden age only for the privileged few. The abandonment of Amarna, however, has given us a unique glimpse into the lives of these people, where they lived, where they worked, and where they were buried. It's truly a living museum, unlike any other. So we've reached the end. Thank you. Dennis, you may take over.
That was great, David. Thank you very, very much. We do have some questions, and maybe we'll get some more come in. The first one was from Andrew. How big were the stelae bordering Amarna? You showed 12 in one of your initial illustrations.
Yeah, they're huge. They are really big. When you go there, you can stand at the bottom of the cliff and look up. They're probably 25 feet high. And they have a lot of text. Bill Murnane, many years ago, I think the 90s, recorded all the texts. And when you read them, they're very interesting because Akhenaten has a lot to say about what he's going to do and what he's going to do for the city. But they're huge, and there are a lot of them.
Okay, thank you. That was, I don't know if I mentioned, that was from Andrew Green. We have another question from Laura. Are there any other mentions of Nefertiti's sister or other siblings?
Not that I'm aware of. Probably a good research project for somebody to look it up, but definitely her sister is recorded at Amarna in those tomb scenes and named. Since most of the references to Nefertiti are in Amarna, you know, there could be more references in tomb scenes that are destroyed and can't be seen anymore. So the answer to the question is I don't know, but at least there is that one reference to her.
Okay, thanks. And another question from Laura. Do you know Akhenaten's siblings' names?
Yes, there was a whole bunch of them. That statue I showed of Akhenaten and Queen Tiye, Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye, has the oldest daughter on it. There's 3 sons that are known, and there's 5 or 6 daughters that are known. Offhand, I can't tell you exactly who they are, but you know they have been recorded. So it was a fairly large family. And of course, Amenhotep III had more than one wife as well, as usually the case.
Wow, okay, thanks. Um, New question from Shauna Scott. Do we have Akhenaten's body?
Good question. Probably not. The KV-55, mummy, which was once proposed to be Akhenaten. Akhenaten was probably in his 40s when he died because he ruled for 17 years. And he wasn't that young when he took over because Amenhotep III lived a very long time. So basically the mummy in KV-55 was proposed once to be Akhenaten, but it's probably someone who's more like 20, 25 years old. So that's where the current thinking is it may be Smenkhare, and it definitely is Tut's father from DNA analysis. So my bet would be on on Smenkhare.
Oh, really?
No, we don't have his mummy for sure. We don't know. There are a few unidentified mummies, so possibly we have it, but it may also have been destroyed when his tomb was destroyed.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else out there? Are there other questions? Okay, again from Shauna. Who was Smenkhare, Akhenaten's son?
Good question. It's been proposed that he's Amenhotep III's son and also a brother of Akhenaten. So that's another theory. Aidan Dodson believes he probably was Akhenaten's son. And if you look at the ages, he would have been born about the time, and who knows why they didn't record the boys' names, they only recorded the girls. But he would have been born about the time that Akhenaten became co-regent with Amenhotep III, which would have made him about 15 or so years old, around the time of year 14 or so, which is when he actually became co-king. And he only ruled for a couple of years in predeceased Akhenaten. So Meritaten lived on and remarried, I believe. But Smenkhare disappeared after only a couple of years and was never sole ruling king. After Akhenaten died, current thinking is that Nefertiti probably took over as regent for King Tut, who was only 9 years old at the time, and that she may have ruled for a couple of years, kind of like Hatshepsut did, as taking command as being pharaoh, as using her name Neferu Aten, which there's records of that being called a king's name, Neferu Aten. So then apparently she died and King Tut was on his own. So he probably would have only been like 7 or so when Akhenaten died.
Okay, thanks. Okay, to the attendee. Okay, here's another one from Dick Harwood. In what tomb is the depiction of Akhenaten holding up his 2 sons with the uraeus on each?
Okay, we don't currently believe those are sons. There's a lot of controversy over that. I actually wrote a paper in the Akhenaten Sun about what's believed on that. He's holding 2 images, which Barry Kemp thinks are 2 images of himself, because Nefertiti is holding an image next to him of herself. And that's from the tomb of Ipi. That's the only possible depiction of Tut, because Bob Hannawalt, when he first took the photo, proposed that that was Smenkhare and Tut. And he proposed one was younger than the other. One appears to be a little bit smaller than the other, but it's only because it's not done in a sort of level fashion. So they both seem to be the same size. So the current thinking is that this is Akhenaten presenting the names of the Aten using little images of himself, and Nefertiti presenting her name using a little image of herself. So not actually depictions of King Tut or Smenkhare.
Okay. That's a good description. Okay, let's see. To all of our attendees, any other questions? Those are some great ones. Okay, well, thank you very much, David. That was a really outstanding presentation. I hope everybody thought that this went fairly well. I thought it did from my end, how it seemed with David's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the attendees now, and we'll have a little bit of maybe chaos, but some discussion. And if people have a drink in their hand, this is milk and cookies if you'd like to stay on. And I'm going to just march down and start allowing everybody to talk.
So Dennis, I noticed when I first was looking that David's thumbnail of him doing the talk was covering part of the slides. So there's a little place where you could do the minimize, and it just had a little thing that said talking, David Pepper talking. So if anybody had that issue, like I did, then that's a solution for future lectures, is that you can get rid of the picture of David talking and just see the slide.
Okay.
This is Carol. I thought it went really well, and cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I thought it went really well too.
David, this is Dick Harwood. I thought your graphics and your slides were outstanding. I do have one question. A lot of the Talatat blocks from East Karnak that Akhenaten built have been found and are in storage at Karnak. What about the Talatat blocks from Akhenaten? Have any of those been actually identified?
Yes. Yeah, they were used to cross the river in some of the later buildings. Barry Kemp has got a whole list of, I think, 20 or so sites where they wound up. Again, kind of like Karnak, they were preserved nicely because they were inside a pylon. The other ones, though, didn't suffer quite as well, being, mortared together at other buildings across the river. So they got reused in different sites.
Hey, David, this is Donnie. If I can add, that lecture I mentioned that I watched this afternoon from the Oriental Institute talked about a stack of Talatat blocks that were actually in Luxor, carted there in the medieval period, and had a lot of Ramses II notes on them. And so Ray Johnson was talking about where those blocks are. I really recommend that lecture to everybody. Very good. It's up on YouTube on the Oriental Institute channel.
Okay, I look forward to that. Figures that Ramses II would get his name carved on him.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So could it be possible that Smenkare was buried in Akhenaten's coffin?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we really don't know. It's possible, I suppose, but since he died before Akhenaten, you'd think he would have had his own coffin, wouldn't you?
It's a pretty elaborate coffin.
Yeah, and how many of these people got hauled off to Luxor? Who knows whether Nefertiti did or didn't. Hard to say. It's possible.